Hi everyone, my name is Alex. I do competitive debating, especially British parliamentary. This is a seminar I did originally live for EDS, which is the Ottawa English Debating Society, and it's called Winning Without Refutation, but it's about weighing and it's a guide to weighing. I wanted to record another version, which is perhaps more succinct and better for YouTube, to share with everyone here. You can find the full notes in a Notion link, which I'll probably put in the description. Let's jump in. So, you can win without doing any refutation. This is technically true. I'm not saying you shouldn't do refutation. Often weighing with refutation is a lot better because you can weigh against weakened versions of their cases. However, what I'm saying is that being charitable can be good, i.e., if you buy and just say, let's agree with everything the opposition team says, and let's weigh against them to prove why our case still beats them, that's often more effective than doing direct refutation. And there's a lot of reasons I think this. Let's talk about three. The first reason is that when there are better teams, it means that the cases are harder to refute because some arguments in debate rounds are often just kind of true. When CAs set motions, they often have arguments and good ones at that in mind already. And if a team makes them, it can be very hard to disprove it, even if you spend a lot of time on it. So with harder cases, you don't want to just do direct ref. Two, judges might have unpredictable priors. They might just buy the argument you're trying to refute, and so you're climbing an uphill battle to try to refute those claims, and your ref might just not land. Third, some judges might not really flow your ref as a contribution. If they're already not really buying it, they won't point to it in DLib and be like, this is a reason why we think that the Gov team should beat the Op team because they directly refuted it. Instead, weighing is often counted more because it seems like a more strategically important contribution, comparing arguments on your side to theirs and giving a clear reason how to give a call for the round in which your team is winning. That gets flowed and counted a lot better. So weighing gets paid more attention to and is more effective even against good teams. So, how do we weigh? There are tons of weighing metrics, but I put them roughly in some buckets. One, by argument impact, two, by the quality of the analysis, and three, by dynamics of the round, so meta strategy in a sense. Firstly is weighing by argument impact. This is the most common. There's a bunch of metrics you can use, and you can probably memorize these through acronyms of your choice. So for example, this spells out PM, SDI, VO. Come up with something to remember it. I'll go through each one and give an example. Probability. This is the likelihood of a case. For example, their argument might be that they increase the chances of winning the election, but even still, their impact only has about a 55% chance of happening. Our impact is certain, and so it ought to be weighed more heavily. Two is magnitude. Magnitude is the number of people or the scale of the case. And so we affect a larger number of countries. Theirs only affects one country. You ought to weigh ours more. Three is severity. This is not the number of people, but for each of those people or cases, how severe the impact is. So, for example, they might help each individual only a little bit, but we help them a massive amount to improve their life and when they need the help the most. Four, time frame. This is just encouraging you to think about time. Perhaps their impacts are short-term, but yours are long-term. Or yours are imminent and urgent, and thus very important, whereas theirs are far in the future, and thus less important. Five, irreversibility. This is basically to say that your impact cannot be reversed, or the harm you're avoiding must be dealt with now, such as climate change, for example, and so you ought to act now. Whereas theirs might be reversible. They might get some benefit, but it could be reversed in the future, thus taking away the gains they make. Perhaps it's something that is politically untenable and likely to be rolled back or face lots of opposition. The last two are vulnerability and obligation. Vulnerability is essentially saying that a group or an individual is more vulnerable and therefore they need the help more and it makes more of a difference in their life versus a group which is not that vulnerable. This is similar to the obligation claim, which is more of a principled based one, where you talk about the principled obligation. Perhaps it is to do reparations, to not do double jeopardy and punish someone twice when the government has failed to help them the first time. And if there's an obligation and you can put some principled analysis into here, then you can weigh on that principle that you ought to prioritize this over another. You can use intuition pumps to compare this to other situations where you think the obligation is a good reason why you ought to vote in your favor. Two, you can weigh by argument analysis. So rather than weighing the impact, where you assume that all the impacts are true, you weigh by the analysis. This is a little bit less charitable, but it's still good. And it's hard to point at this exactly. But what do I mean? One, mechanism quality. If the mechanism is good, For example, it has lots of nuance, or it seems proportional, i.e. they do a lot of work to prove the case, and the outcome is pretty proportional to the proof, and it's not like you've only said like a few words, this claims a massive impact like nuclear fallout or whatever, then your case is probably more mechanistically rigorous. This probably increases the likelihood of your case, and thus the amount of impact you can claim to prove. The better you've proven the case, the more you can say it has occurred. One example for nuanced is to say that you point at specific situations and case studies of examples in which your analysis is effective, and therefore it is far more reasonable and realistic. Your case is more grounded in the real world. What are some other things to talk about here? Inherence, how unique is the argument caused by the motion? For example, if the motion is about polycules and how those are either good or bad for the world, but the analysis is about economics and about employment in terms of where people live and whatnot, that doesn't seem to be so specifically tied to the motion, and thus you could somewhat say that it isn't very realistic or is less likely. Another one is by problem solution gap. Perhaps they've pointed at a big problem like climate change, but the solution they claim is actually very small, but they say that the solution is going to address the entire problem. You can say there's a gap there in how big those are, and thus it's unlikely that you can buy their analysis. One final thing to talk about for likelihood analysis is you can often do something by counting the number of burdens. For example, you can say, our case is simple. We only have to prove these two things, and we prove them very well in order for you to buy 100% of our case. So you can buy all of our impact to its fullest extent. On the contrary, for their case to work, they need to prove A, B, C, and D links in order to buy the entirety of their argument, or else none of their impact actually occurs. And the issue is that if each of those links is only 90% likely, like if you believe each of those proofs 90%, being very charitable, then if you do the probability math, it's only about 65% likely that their impact occurs. So you can only credit it about 65% expected value. And so by comparison, our analysis is much simpler and is much more likely. So things of these nature. The third bucket is weighing by round dynamics. This is about strategy and how the debate has occurred. For example, if you have an argument that is responsive with the other side, but perhaps your opening team does not respond to the other side as well, you can weigh this as a reason to beat your opening team. You can also explain how you're independent from deadlocks, and thus if on front half, X issue, which goes either way for government or opposition, is uncertain and it's a little bit unclear, you are independent from that issue and you can buy your case fully, and so it's more likely. And so in that round, you stand independently. You can also talk about stance. Was it too hard or too soft? Did they take a huge stance where it's very unrealistic and we can't really buy it? Or was it too soft and we undercredit it because their impact and their margin is not very big in this actual debate? So talking about how the argument behaves inside the round can be good. One caveat, some judges don't like this stuff, other judges do like this stuff, and talking about strategy in specific, doing the meta debating, so be careful with your judge and who it perhaps is. But if you want to make this more effective, don't just say the buzzwords to say, our case is more independent. Explain what that independence unlocks for your case in terms of its actual ability to land in a concrete impact and specific creditable concrete effects on the world that can be given to your team. So don't just drop the buzzwords in. Okay, so how do you pick which tools to use? We've just talked about tons of weighing metrics. You should A, pick the metrics you're winning the most on. Don't talk about metrics like scale if the other team has an impact with far more scale than yours, of course. 2, or B, pick up to 3 metrics. So don't use too many. It's quality over quantity, so don't talk about all of them. Pick a few, explain them well, and explain them specifically. What can be even better is part C. Give one home run, very certain metric in which you win on. This is probably better than giving a bunch of random metrics where you might win or might not win. When should you prep your weighing? You should probably do it in prep time. So after you've built the proof for your impact and you've solidly proven the case, you can spend your leftover time practicing the weighing to figure out how you're going to position it in the round against the most likely opponent cases. Also, you should pay attention during the round. Listen and flow other teams. You need to hear what other teams are saying in order to effectively respond to it. If you're only weighing your case but not comparing it against others, you aren't actually doing comparative weighing. You're just explaining the scale of the impact of your own case. I think it only counts as weighing if you compare your arguments versus theirs, so you must be comparative. One note before I talk about what's on the slide right now is that make sure you've proven the argument before you start weighing it. If you are still struggling with proving the argument, you're going to be counting your eggs before they hatch. If you do your weighing, make sure you prove the case first. That's the most important thing. Okay, when you're deciding arguments, Pick ones that you can foresee weighing well on metrics, and not ones that you're going to lose on most likely. In other words, when you're picking your arguments in prep time, or you're picking your extension during the round, choose them based on the weighing you can do for that argument. And if you find an argument which is very intuitive to weigh, you think it has good impact, you think it has a standalone metric which you could clearly beat the other teams on, pick those ones. How do you do this in your speech? What do you say? You say things like, why does X argument matter more than Y argument that they say? Well, we win on Z metric because of motion-specific details. And you have to be specific to the motion. You can't just say these buzzwords. Actually explain why you win on those metrics. For example, we win on time frame. Our specific impact on environmental damage, specifically in heating the planet, is long-term. And every half degree is irreversible and does massive amounts of harm. But their economic benefit of short-term growth is only localized and it's short-lived. Economic cycles come and go. These projects are only going to last for a little bit, and future generations won't benefit from them. So on time frame, as well as irreversibility, which I kind of threw in there, we're clearly winning this. Or for example, likelihood. For opposition scenario to happen, 4 things need to go perfectly right. They rely on A, B, C, and D. But our impact is a direct effect on the actor in this debate and is certain and can be credited. Again, be comparative with other arguments within a metric. Listen and flow other teams so you can weigh comparatively. Don't just impact your argument and say why you have such big scale. You need to compare it. Part 2, some higher level stuff. So that's the basics of weighing. Here is some fancier stuff. Cross-clash weighing. Be comparative between metrics. So if everyone took my advice on the previous slide for weighing, so let's say your argument's going to win on one metric, we win on magnitude, but the other team is going to win on another metric, like we win on severity, right? Then how does the judge know who to value more? Why should they necessarily value one of these over the other? So then you have to do this cross-metric, cross-clash weighing, where you explain why your metric matters more than theirs. So you ought to care more about scale, judge, than about the severity. Why? And how do you explain this? So you can do tiebreakers through things like intuition pumps. You can, for example, introduce a new weighing metric to break the tie, or an intuition pump from a similar trade-off. For example, we care more about the short term than the long term here because the actor in this debate cares more about the next election. And so by the nature of this debate, our impact is more important. Or our impact, yes, reaches fewer people, but these people, and you bring in a new metric, are more vulnerable and they benefit far more from than the marginal quality of life gain the opposition, yes, gives to many more people. This is why we tax a lot of people, but the benefits directly to those who need it most, even if it isn't to the same number of people or to the same scale. This is just good. That's an example. Another way you can do this, if you have a lot of time and you're confident, is you can win on their metric too. So for example, if the other team is trying to win on scale, you can claim that your case also matters for scale. So you could say, by helping this group, which is very vulnerable, they become less of a burden in the future. So for example, if you're helping them with a health issue when they're young, for example, to stop them from smoking, then in the future, they put less of a burden on the healthcare system, which allows other people to pay less taxes in the long run and also have access to shorter healthcare lines. So you can try to win on their metric as well. In this case, it was scale. How does weighing relate to framing? This is a slight tangent, but framing is basically when people explain what matters most in the debate and they say what you ought to care about. And you often want to do this and you want to orofarm and try to sound objective and reasonable and get the other team to agree with you. What you can do is if you frame the worldview up front, you can plant the seed and put the judge in your worldview already so that they agree with the weighing you eventually say. This makes your weighing seem less random. If in the future you bring up the weighing and you're talking about we ought to care about those who are most vulnerable and we have an obligation to help them for XYZ reason, it might seem thrown in there and just like you're trying to win the debate. But if your intro was framing and you talked about the legacy of colonialism and how it was so harmful to specific groups in the past and why this ought to be something we care deeply about, then you run your argument, you introduce all of that, and then you talk about your weighing on those grounds of vulnerability and obligation, it aligns with the worldview that you set up at the very start. And so then the judge is already in the mindset to buy into that claim. Maybe the other team even buys in and tries to beat you on your own grounds on vulnerability and obligation, where you have a very strongly placed argument. So use framing and weighing together. Summary. Frame the worldview up front so your weighing seems less random later. Listen and flow other teams to make your weighing maximally comparative and weigh comparatively within and between metrics using motion-specific details. How do you get better at weighing? A, you should matter file. Build a matter file, so write them and think of them and research them ahead of time. Common weighing. For example, how do you compare impacts which are high risk, high reward, so it's not certain to happen, versus low risk, almost certain, but low reward? So for example, should we spend money on research and R&D? Is that likely to actually give returns? Or for example, how much do we prepare for black swan events and things which are really bad? But there's all kinds of these. How do you compare short-term versus long-term impacts? How do you compare scale versus severity? All of these things. Being able to win A versus B and B versus A is very good. You can drill this, B, by picking two opposing arguments and weighing them against each other. Take two real arguments, explain why A beats B, then explain why B beats A. Then you can go back and try to explain why A beats B, even assuming that B has given the weighing they just did, and then go back and forth, and you make your weighing stronger and stronger. Okay, that's about it. Some quick questions that I want to talk about. Okay, so there's what's on the screen. You can read this if you want. But also, people ask, should you weigh in the first speech or the second speech? This depends how fast you can prepare it. If you can prepare it ahead of time and you can prove all of your arguments well, then perhaps you can put it in your first speech. But often the first speech could focus only on proving it really well, and then the second can go in and weigh. The second will then also get to hear other arguments first, so they don't have to do their weighing in the dark, preemptively assuming what the other team will run. They can kind of know already. Should you do your weighing at the start or at the end of an argument? You can perhaps do it at the start so that the judge kind of knows what your argument is doing, where it's headed, and thus gives them a reason to care, and they know how to credit it when it does come out. But if you don't have time to prep it, or if you want to give a more larger weighing, it's often good to do more weighing at the end of the argument and just introduce the idea briefly in a short headline at the start of your argument instead. Yeah, I can't think of anything off the top of my head else to say about it. I hope that was helpful. Have fun weighing. Oh yeah, of course, I didn't come up with this stuff myself. Lots of people taught me how to weigh and how to use these skills, so thanks to everyone. I hope this was helpful, and bye-bye.